My name is Elena Moore, and I stood in a courtroom watching my own father try to steal the inheritance my grandparents left to me, the same grandparents who raised me after he abandoned me the day I was born. He tried to paint me as undeserving, but what he didn't know was that I had proof of every year he was gone, every holiday he missed, every tear he caused. This isn't just a story about money. It's about loyalty, betrayal, and a love that outlived death. Where are you watching from? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. He stood there, tall and polished, with that perfect politician posture and that perfectly rehearsed expression of disappointed authority while saying, "This girl has no discipline and no understanding of value. She squanders what she does not deserve." The judge, his longtime golf partner, nodded with the kind of familiarity that made my stomach twist. My father's lawyer gave a small, confident smirk, certain this battle would be swift and easy, certain I would crumble or cry or behave like the wounded child they believed I still was. They had no idea. While they were conspiring to take what wasn't theirs, I had already begun preparing to destroy the foundation their illusion of control was built on. But to understand how we reached that courtroom, you need to know where this began, because this story did not start with legal documents or inheritance. It started the day I was born and the day my mother died. My father, Congressman Charles Moore, blamed me for her death. Not quietly, not while wrestling with grief, not in the private, complicated way that sorrow sometimes twists love. No, he blamed me with certainty, with bitterness, with the kind of coldness that settles into bone. He left the hospital the day I came into the world, leaving my grandparents, Margaret and Henry Moore, to take a newborn home while simultaneously grieving the loss of their daughter-in-law. They could have seen me as a reminder of pain. Instead, they saw a reason to keep loving. They saved me in every way a person can be saved. My childhood was built around them. Soft morning sunlight in the kitchen, my grandmother's voice humming old jazz melodies, my grandfather's laughter while he helped me build forts in the living room out of couch cushions and blankets. I did not grow up lacking love. I grew up surrounded by it. They attended every school performance, every scraped knee moment, every birthday, every late night fear. My grandmother taught me how to paint, guiding my hand gently over paper until I understood how color could speak feelings that words sometimes couldn't. My grandfather read me stories every night, his voice shaping worlds and heroes and adventures before sleep carried me away. If I had only ever known them, I would have believed that love was effortless and steady. But there was always an absence in the corner of my life, a quiet, unspoken space at holidays, a missing chair at school events, a name people hesitated to ask about. My father. Every holiday, my grandparents still tried. My grandfather would stand by the phone, dialing with hope trembling in his hands. My grandmother would set an extra place at the table, even though deep down we all knew no one would sit there. When I was 5, I asked why my father never visited, and my grandmother told me he was very busy helping people. Even before I had words for the feeling, I recognized the shape of a lie spoken for love's sake. So I learned early that some questions cause pain, and I stopped asking them. By middle school, I already understood who my father was. I didn't learn it from conversations or family stories. I learned it from the television. I watched him stand at podiums and give passionate speeches about family values, about the importance of raising children well, about community. I watched him shake hands and hug constituents and beam with the warmth of a man who cared deeply. I watched crowds applaud his sincerity. I watched his approval ratings grow. And I watched all of it knowing that I had never heard his voice address me. Not once. He was a father to the public, not to me. Still, my grandparents hoped. They believed grief had twisted him, and that time might untangle the knot. I learned sooner than they did that some people are simply empty where others hold love. I graduated high school with honors and was accepted into Duke University. My grandparents cried and celebrated and told every neighbor, every friend, every stranger in the grocery store. My father sent me a typed congratulations card signed by his assistant. No signature, no phone call, not even a voicemail. That was the day the last thread of wanting him snapped. Not with anger, not with heartbreak, just release. You cannot lose what you never had. During my time in college, my grandmother began slowing down. Small things at first, forgetting names, misplacing common items, repeating pieces of conversation. We all pretended not to see it because acknowledging it meant something was changing. But change doesn't care whether you are ready. By the time I was 21, she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. I packed my bags and came home without hesitation. When I told her I wasn't going back, she cried and told me I shouldn't sacrifice my life for hers. But love is not sacrifice when it is freely given. She had raised me when she didn't have to. Now it was my turn to be steady for her. I cared for her for 2 years. Some days she remembered my name and her paintings and the way sunlight fell through the kitchen windows. Some days she looked at me like I was a stranger. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes slowly, stealing pieces before taking the whole. My grandfather called my father over and over during those 2 years, begging him to visit, begging him to see his mother before she forgot him entirely. Every time, my father had an excuse. Campaign, bill discussion, public appearances, television interviews. My grandmother died without hearing his voice one last time. My father did not attend the funeral. He called 3 days later, not to ask how we were, not to apologize, not to express regret. He called to ask who would inherit her family lake house. My grandfather's heartbreak turned sharp that day. He told my father he would receive nothing. Not the house, not the money, not the land, not a memory. And so he rewrote his will, leaving everything to me. Which brings us back to that courtroom. When my grandfather rewrote his will, he did it quietly, not out of secrecy, but out of acceptance. Acceptance that his son was not simply grieving or complicated or emotionally distant. He was selfish. Irrevocably, fundamentally selfish. I didn't know the exact contents of the new will at the time, only that my grandfather began handling documents with a gravity I had never seen before. He seemed older now, not just in his face, but in his posture, like the years of hope he had carried for my father had finally laid themselves down to die. I moved through the house carefully, afraid to disturb the delicate silence grief had left behind, but determined to be present, to be useful, to be a reason for him, to keep going. Even after my grandmother passed, my grandfather woke early every morning dressed neatly and read the newspaper with a cup of black coffee. But some days I would come downstairs and find him sitting in her chair instead of his, holding her old shawl in his hands as though warming his palms with memory. On those days, we didn't speak much. I would sit beside him, wordless, just being there. Sometimes love doesn't require conversation. Sometimes companionship is enough. But grief does not stay still. It changes shape every day. In the beginning, it felt like a storm, loud and relentless. Then one morning, I woke to find my grandfather had slept through breakfast, something he had never done. When I gently knocked on his door, he opened it with a tired smile, his eyes red. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I knew he had cried. I didn't say anything. I simply made breakfast and sat with him while he picked at his food, like someone forcing their body to keep going. A few months later, his doctor confirmed what I had already sensed. His heart was weakening, not from disease, not from age alone, from loss. There are wounds no surgeon can repair. Caring for him became the center of my life, the way caring for my grandmother once had been. I took over balancing medication, managing appointments, organizing financial statements. I learned to recognize the small signs, when his breath had a slight tremor, when he stood up just a little too slowly, when he pressed his palm to his chest because it ached. He never complained. He never asked for help. That was the kind of man. He was steady, composed, gentle, even while he was breaking. My father never called. Not once. Not to ask how his father was coping. Not to apologize. Not to extend a hand across decades of distance. The silence was louder than any argument could have been. And yet, my grandfather was still his father. He still loved him. Love doesn't disappear just because it is undeserved. But love can close a door. One evening, just as autumn was beginning to settle into the air, my grandfather asked me to sit with him in his study. The room smelled like old books and cedar, and his desk was neatly arranged except for one envelope, resting in the center like awaiting truth. He didn't hand it to me. He just stared at it for a long while before saying, "I spent so many years waiting for Charles to come home." His voice was quiet, not bitter, not angry, just tired. Your grandmother believed until her last breath that he would walk through that door and say he was sorry. His hands rested on the wood surface, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. But love is not an endless resource. Eventually, even the deepest well runs dry. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Silence, again, was enough. He continued, "You have given me more than he ever has, not because it was your obligation, but because you chose to. You have been my family in every way that matters." He looked at me with tired eyes that still held the warm ember of affection. "I need you to promise me one thing." His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with certainty. "Do not let your father take what your grandmother and I spent our lives building. Not for ourselves, for you." I promised him. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then he slid the envelope toward me. "This is my final will. It leaves everything to you. The properties, the accounts, the business shares, everything." His expression hardened just slightly. "Charles will contest it. He will make you out to be ungrateful. He will try to shame you. But do not bend. Do not explain yourself. Do not justify what you have earned." The weight of his words settled deep in my bones. "Stand firm." I didn't cry then. I didn't allow myself to. Grief is patient. It waits for its moment. He passed away 2 months later, quietly, in his sleep. I found him sitting in his chair in the study, a book resting open in his lap. He looked peaceful, like he had simply followed the woman he loved into the next room. My father did not come to the funeral, not out of cruelty this time, but because there was nothing left to gain. The moment the obituary was published, though, he called, not to ask how I was doing, not to ask about arrangements, but to ask when we would be meeting about the estate. I told him there was nothing to discuss. The silence on the line was sharp, cold, calculated. Then came the lawsuit. He claimed I was manipulative, that I had taken advantage of my grandparents, that I had isolated them, that I had stolen their affection. He filed motions. He hired aggressive attorneys. He demanded control of the estate. He believed his title, his influence, and his confidence would be enough to crush me. And that is how we ended up in that courtroom. Him on one side, smirking, righteous, powerful. Me on the other, quiet, steady, certain. He thought I was the child he abandoned years ago. He didn't realize I had become the person they raised me to be. The day of the court hearing arrived with a cold gray sky, the kind that seems to press itself down against your skin. I woke up before sunrise, not because of nerves, but because I had learned long ago that peace belongs to those who prepare before the world opens its eyes. I brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, the same kitchen where my grandmother once made cinnamon biscuits on Sunday mornings, where my grandfather read the paper and shared headlines with me, laughing at the small absurdities of politics and life. Their absence was a weight, but also a shield. I carried them with me now. I was not walking into that courtroom alone, no matter what anyone believed. My father arrived fashionably late, as always. He entered the courtroom with the calculated air of a man who was used to being watched, admired, respected. He wore the exact shade of navy that photographs well. His tie was perfect. His hair was combed with deliberate precision. Everything about him was curated to project the image of a man who was right simply because he existed. He didn't look at me when he entered. He swept his gaze across the room as if deciding which space best deserved his presence. Then he sat down, confident that no one would question him, because no one ever had. The judge greeted him warmly, like an old friend. The kind of greeting that wasn't spoken but understood. Shared dinners, shared favors, shared loyalties. I watched it all, quiet and still, my expression unreadable. I had learned from my grandmother that silence is not weakness. Silence is observation. Silence is advantage. My father's lawyer opened with theatrics. He spoke about legacy, about family intention, about a grieving widower who had been cruelly cut out of the estate he believed was his birthright. He painted a picture of me as a manipulative granddaughter, someone who had inserted herself into the final years of my grandparents' lives, taking advantage of their vulnerability, as if I hadn't been the one cooking meals, as if I hadn't been the one administering medication, as if I hadn't been the one sitting awake at 3 a.m. holding my grandmother's hand while she cried because she couldn't remember the face of her own mother. He spoke as though love was a transaction, and I was a thief. He spoke loudly, confidently, oblivious to the truth. My father sat back, hands folded, wearing the expression of a man who believed the world operated in equations, and that his power plus his money would always equal victory. He truly believed that narratives were stronger than facts, that appearances were stronger than reality, that image was stronger than love. He didn't know that I had been preparing for this day long before he ever filed his claim. When the lawyer finished, the judge leaned toward my father slightly and gave a small nod, a nod of reassurance, a nod that said, "Don't worry, I've got you." A nod that was supposed to terrify me. It didn't. When my turn came, my attorney asked if I wanted to speak. I did, but I did not speak with tears. I did not speak with rage. Those emotions are reactive, and I was no longer reacting to my father. I was defining him. I began by telling the court about my grandmother, not about her illness, but about who she was when she lived fully. I spoke about the soft clink of her wedding ring against the porcelain teacup she used every morning. I described how she laughed with her whole chest, how her voice softened when she read poetry, how she once painted a mural of a sunrise on the old garden wall because she believed colors could heal sadness. I showed the court who she was as a person, not a possession. Then I told them about my grandfather, the way he taught me that hard work is not measured by exhaustion, but by purpose. How he sat through every school event, even when I wasn't very good. How he believed that presence was the highest form of love. How he held my grandmother every night, even when she couldn't remember his name. How he whispered to her that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was home. Then I spoke about my father, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I told the court how many holidays he missed, How many birthdays he ignored. How many hospital visits never came. I did not accuse him. I did not raise my voice. I simply told the truth, plainly and thoroughly, with dates, with examples, with calm certainty. The courtroom was silent, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. Everyone in the room could feel the difference between love given and love abandoned. Then came the documents. For months, without speaking a word of it aloud, I had been building a timeline. Records of my father's absence. Records of my grandparents' care for me. Financial statements proving that every expense, every medical bill, every household cost had been paid by them and not by him. Photographs, letters, voicemails, medical approvals, caregiver logs, and finally, my grandfather's handwritten journal entries from the last 2 years of his life, where he documented, day by day, the decline of the woman he loved and the silence of the son he had hoped would return. But the final piece, the piece that broke everything open, was a video. My grandfather, sitting in the study, voice steady, eyes clear, speaking directly to the camera. He said my name. He said my father's name. He said exactly why the inheritance was mine. He said exactly what my father abandoned. He said exactly what love looks like and what it does not. My father's face changed. For the first time since I had known him as a concept more than a person, I watched certainty crack. The expression he had worn his entire life, entitlement, flickered. The judge shifted in his chair. My father's lawyer looked sideways, suddenly calculating, suddenly worried. Silence again filled the room, but this time it was my silence, my strength, my certainty. My father opened his mouth to speak, but there was nothing for him to say. There are no words that can outweigh truth spoken with love. The ruling came 1 week later. Everything remained mine. My father was denied every request, every claim, every appeal. The judge's tone was stiff, uncomfortable, like a man forced to acknowledge a truth he had hoped to avoid. My father walked out of the courtroom without looking at me. Not once. I did not call after him. I did not watch him go. I simply stood there, breathing in the quiet air of a chapter closing. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Later that evening, I returned to the house. The sun was setting, spilling warm gold across the porch. I stood in the doorway, looking at the place that held every memory that shaped me. I lit one candle for my grandmother and one for my grandfather. I sat in silence, not mourning, not aching, remembering. I realized then that revenge was never about destroying him. It was about protecting the love that raised me. And I had done exactly that. After the ruling, life did not return to normal immediately. Healing is not a switch you flip. It is a gradual unfurling, like petals opening one fragile layer at a time. At first, I stayed in the house, walking through the rooms slowly, as though reacquainting myself with the space now that the shadow of legal battle had passed. Every corner held memory. Every floorboard held footsteps of lives no longer present. The silence was no longer heavy with grief. It was thoughtful, reflective. I could breathe again. But peace never lasts long when a powerful man feels embarrassed. My father did not accept the court's decision. Of course he didn't. Men like him do not lose. Or rather, they don't know how to face the fact that they have already lost long before the world notices. He didn't call. He didn't show up at the house. Instead, he used the one battlefield he was familiar with, the court of public opinion. A week after the ruling, his campaign team leaked a story to the local press implying that I manipulated an elderly man suffering emotional vulnerability to secure the estate. They made me sound predatory, calculating, evil even. A woman who preyed on the weak. They painted my grandfather as senile, confused, incapable of making rational decisions. They slipped poison into his memory because they could no longer touch his life. People read headlines. They rarely read the truth behind them. Some neighbors, the ones who always admired my father's public persona, began avoiding eye contact. Women at the grocery store pretended not to recognize me. A barista who used to compliment my sweaters suddenly served me with careful politeness, as if I were dangerous. Reputation is a fickle thing. One whisper can turn years of understanding into doubt. But I did not break, because I knew something my father had forgotten. Truth has patience. Lies require maintenance. And I waited. I attended every appointment to formally transfer the estate assets. I met with attorneys and accountants and financial advisors who had worked with my grandfather for decades. They knew him. They knew his mind. They knew his intentions. Not one of them wavered. They helped me structure the foundation. He wanted me to continue running. They supported me quietly, professionally, loyally. My father continued to perform outrage for the cameras. He gave interviews where his voice shook with pain as he described a daughter who cut him out in grief. He stood on podiums saying he hoped one day reconciliation will be possible. And people, those who never knew him beyond screens, believed him. It would have hurt if I hadn't known the truth of his heart long ago. The turning point came 3 months later. I had received an invitation from the City Council's Community Outreach Board to attend an awardedney honoring local contributors to children's health programs. My grandmother had volunteered for those programs for 30 years. There was a plaque with her name on it in the children's hospital hallway. I wasn't going to miss it. When I arrived, the auditorium was full. Journalists, donors, local families. I saw my father near the stage, surrounded by cameras, shaking hands, smiling that polished smile that never reached his eyes. He hadn't expected me to attend. His expression flickered, not enough for the room to see, but enough for me to feel. The award presenter spoke about Margaret Moore's dedication to service, about her warmth, her hours of unpaid labor, her tireless presence in hospital playrooms and family waiting halls.